to WrestleManias. We're your co-hosts. I'm Rich.
I'm Tim.
This is a special popcorn match edition where we delve into a topic of tangentially, or sometimes not at all, related to WrestleMania. This episode, in honor of Black History Month, we're taking a look at Black representation in professional wrestling. We've got some fascinating history to get into, so let's do this.
All right, so the impetus for this episode came when we were watching WrestleMania X8 in preparation for our last podcast post, which featured The Rock in a huge match with Hulk Hogan, Jazz in a women's title match, Ron Simmons, a.k.a. Farouk, and Devon Dudley in a tag team championship match, plus Booker T, who has recently arrived from WCW in an undercard match versus Edge, and Maven, who was the winner of Season 1 of Tough Enough in a hardcore championship match. It occurred to us that this was probably the most diverse WrestleMania card we've had to date, so we decided to do a little digging through the first 17 shows to see what we could find. This is probably a good moment for the disclaimer that we are two white guys, and the intent of this particular episode is to celebrate and help educate about the rich history of African Americans in professional wrestling. The terms colored and Negro are used only in terms of referring to the proper names of championships of the past that many regional promotions had, and obviously do not reflect our own beliefs or language that we would use normally. So let's get into it a little bit and talk just a bit about the history of Black wrestlers in WrestleManias. As I said, we really noticed with 18 the diversity of the card there, and thought, well, let's see what these past WrestleManias have looked like. So we went all the way back to number one, looking at just in-ring talent. So that's wrestlers and managers and valets, not necessarily, special guest referees like Muhammad Ali or special guest timekeepers, or of course the musical talent. We have Gladys Knight, we've had Run DMC, and an array of talent around the ring, but not necessarily performing wrestling matches. So way back at the first WrestleMania, we had Special Delivery Jones in a big squash match with King Kong Bundy, Junkyard Dog, of course, with Greg the Hammer Valentine, and the inimitable Mr. T in a main event tag match. That was the very first one, so kind of off to a relatively good representation, I would say, in the first WrestleMania.
Yeah, for sure. Just a reminder that Mr. T is not a professional wrestler, though. That Mr. T was a boxer at the time and an actor.
Lies. These are lies. Mr. T lives in my heart as whatever he wants to be in the moment. So Mr. T actually, popped up again in WrestleMania 2, of course, against Rowdy Piper in a boxing match, better befitting his skill set. WrestleMania 3 had a couple of great matches, Junkyard Dog versus King Harley Race, and then Butch Reed with manager Slick versus Coco Beware is our first WrestleMania match featuring two Black performers, wrestling against each other. So that's kind of exciting. WrestleMania 5, we had Slick again as the manager for the Twin Towers. And I want to just mention WrestleMania 5 for dishonorable mention for Akeem the African Dream, who was not a Black performer, who was a white guy from the South, who put on a fake, quote unquote, African gimmick. It doesn't translate particularly well to watching it today, I would say. I much prefer, that performer's one-man gang gimmick. It's more interesting and less offensive.
And bad dancing. Horrible dancing.
Terrible dancing.
I think that was his concept of being African, was just he did dancing.
It's the worst. This kind of like weird jiving thing that he did. It looked like he'd taken too many Benadryls or something. WrestleMania 5 also featured Bad News Brown versus Hacksaw Jim Duggan. WrestleMania 6 has a somewhat infamous promo from Rowdy Piper, who was facing Bad News Brown, where he performed it in half blackface. It may have been scrubbed from the Peacock by now. It wasn't okay in 1980, whatever, and it's definitely not okay now. So that one is out there on the internet, but not probably on the Peacock these days. WrestleMania 11, actually, so 11 years into this thing, was our first Black performer in a singles main event match, and that was again, not a professional wrestler, a football player, Lawrence Taylor, versus Bam Bam Bigelow, one of the, I think, stranger main events we've had at a WrestleMania. And it turned out that Lawrence Taylor actually had some moves, I think, right? Like when we watched that, we thought somebody had clearly trained that guy.
Yeah, he jumped from the second rope and stuff, and he did like a bulldog on Bam Bam Bigelow, and Bam Bam did a great job of making Lawrence Taylor look good and make him look like Lawrence Taylor knew what he was doing. So,
yeah,
it was more entertaining than expected.
Absolutely. I think we both were sort of pleasantly surprised when we watched that match. And of course, LT showed up with a cadre of professional football players on his corner for that match. So no intimidation factor there at all. WrestleMania 13, we had Rocky Maivia, the first gimmick for Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, of course, versus the Sultan. That match also featured an appearance by The Rock's father, Rocky Johnson, so it's kind of notable here. Ahmed Johnson, who was the first Black Intercontinental Champion for the WWF, was with the Legion of Doom versus the Nation of Domination. Of course, Farouk Ron Simmons, D'Lo Brown, and manager Clarence Mason. And we think the Nation of Domination was probably the first sort of black stable for WWF, and that when they arrive and the variety of performers they bring with them is when we sort of really start to up the diversity factor for our WrestleManias. And I'm just going to skip ahead to WrestleMania 18, which we already mentioned is an especially diverse card, and we just posted a podcast episode about that. So take a listen, check it out. And that's how we got to the next section on Black Wrestlers in History.
We thought after recapping just black wrestlers at the first 18 WrestleManias that we've watched, that it would be fun to start poking around at the history of African American wrestlers and learning some amazing facts about them. First one that we thought we would talk about is Vero Small. Vero Small is known as the first black professional collar and elbow wrestler back in the 1800s. When I say professional, I mean by he earned his living by doing so. So there may have been other black wrestlers at the time and such, but he was the one that was actually making the money, paying his rent with wrestling. So he was born in 1854 or so. They're not exactly sure because he was born into enslavement in Beaufort, South Carolina. And he was freed / abandoned by the 13th Amendment. So the first known match that he was in was against a guy named Mike Horrigan in 1881, and he was a well-known wrestler of the time in Vermont. He was a well-known collar and elbow wrestling champion and such. And collar and elbow wrestling was a type of grappling wrestling that was really famous with Irish immigrants and the lower classes in New England. Mike was known as one of the best, and after his first match with Mike, Horrigan decided to take him in and train him. And that's at that point when Vero Small took the name of Black Sam of Vermont. And he ended up having an amazing career. And before, though, he was kind of a troublemaker, or thought to be. He actually escaped from prison when he had been arrested for burglary. He was arrested, found guilty, sent to prison, and escaped. It was a brand new prison in Vermont, and so they think there might have been some security loopholes that they missed when constructing it, and him and a bunch of other convicts had taken advantage of it. Now, there's also belief that he was not involved in the burglary whatsoever and was just arrested because of the color of his skin. So he was one of the fighters in rotation at the famous Bastille of the Bowery Tavern in New York. He had won the Vermont Collar and Elbow Championship, and which had made him possibly the very first wrestling champion of African descent in America. And so once he had won that, and his name started spreading, he went down into New York and took a job at the Bastille de Bowery, fighting other collar and elbow fighters in New York City. And at one point, he had a no contest match with another wrestler named Billy McCallum, and this pissed Billy off. And Billy, while Vero was sleeping, snuck into his apartment and shot him in the neck.
Holy crap.
And somehow Vero survived that and was back wrestling within 3 months.
Man, this guy sounds like a total badass.
Yeah, he was hardcore.
Suck it, hardcore championship.
Yeah, so after all of that, he ended up joining John Clark's troupe of wrestlers from Philadelphia. And what's interesting about John Clark is, as opposed to being the establishment owner and hiring wrestlers to come in and fight and having taken a share of the purse and stuff, John Clark was more of like Vince McMahon or Tony Khan, where he signs a series of wrestlers into a troupe and they fight each other and they travel around fighting each other, kind of like a circus, or like modern day wrestling.
Oh, wow.
It was very innovative for the time. And so his last recorded match was in 1885, and he basically disappears into obscurity. He does show up in the 1910 census records for New York City as a wage earner loading trucks. And after that, there's no more record of him.
Huh.
So it's believed he probably died between 1910 and 1920. They have no idea where his grave is.
Oh, wow. What a fascinating guy. What a life, man.
Yeah, it's quite amazing to go from slavery to his name in the newspaper.
Yeah.
And if you want to know more about this guy, there is an interesting 18-minute documentary about him called Black Sam's Statue by Elliot Marquis. It's free to watch on Vimeo, probably on YouTube too. I highly recommend checking that out. That's where a lot of this information came from.
That's great. I'm glad you were able to dig that up and learn a little bit about Mr. Small. I mean, so I guess it's getting shot in the neck. I mean, that's like go away heat, right? Like that's somebody doesn't really want you to be around anymore.
Yeah, I mean that's taking kayfabe a little too far, in my opinion.
If Stone Cold maybe had had 6 more months in the Attitude Era, he probably would have worked that into an angle.
Yeah. So the next guy we thought we would look into was Reginald Siki. So this isn't the Reginald Siki that's still alive in Toronto running a karaoke bar and stuff. That was a professional wrestler as well. But this is the original Reginald Siki. His original name was Reginald Barry, and he was born in 1899. And he is recognized as the first world colored heavyweight champion in 1924, and he held that title for 11 years.
Good Lord.
He was only allowed to compete against other non-white wrestlers, which pissed him off, and so he said goodbye and took off for Europe. So that in Europe, where they're a little bit less racist, allowed him to fight against white wrestlers. And that's when he really started making the money, obviously. And while he lived in Prague, he converted to Islam and took the name of Kamal Abdel Rahman, but he still wrestled under the name Reginald Siki. And in 1942, he was captured by Nazis and was interned in the Titmonig Castle for being American. He was considered an American political prisoner and not like a prisoner of war or like concentration camp persecution kind of guy. So they did receive regular Red Cross supplements, and he went on record in an interview saying that if it hadn't been for the Red Cross drops that they were able to steal from the Nazis, as the Nazis were taking the supplies for themselves, that they would have most likely died.
Oh, wow.
And he was released in 1944 in a prisoner exchange. And at that time, he returned to the United States. Obviously, you want to get the hell out of Europe at that point. And so he came back and went immediately to Los Angeles and started wrestling in the Coliseum in Los Angeles, being one of their headliners and packing the houses. Easily crowds of 10 to 20,000 people would come to see him, and he actually jobbed to a young Curious George, young Gorgeous George in 1947, and then just a year later he died.
Wow, man,
he died relatively young.
Another crazy story, crazy life. You imagine leaving the U.S. because it's too racist, and Europe. You're like, oh, Europe will be better. Oh, Nazis,
right. Just he couldn't dodge it. But while in Europe, he made a ton of money and was packing arenas and outdoor venues all across the continent, from England to Greece. And he was easily drawing 20, 30,000 people just to come see him in main event against like the local champion and stuff like that. So
that's very cool.
He definitely was a draw. So the third guy we thought we would talk about, and he's a more familiar name, and that is Bobo Brazil.
Yes.
So Bobo was born in 1924 as Houston Harris, which personally I thought was already an awesome wrestling name.
That's pretty good.
It's a pretty good name, but I guess Bobo Brazil is, I would imagine, carries more of the ethnic persuasion that promoters would want at the time. So his initial name was supposed to be Boo Boo Brazil.
Oh no!
But a ring announcer mispronounced it and said Bobo. Therefore, he became Bobo.
That's better. Right. Yeah. Thank God for that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little easier to take.
Yeah.
So he is known as like the Jackie Robinson of professional wrestling for breaking the color barrier. But that was mostly because he was so good, promoters couldn't ignore the money draw that he was. And so they were like, segregation, whatever. He makes me money. put him in the ring with the white guys. It'll be awesome.
Wow.
So, and before he was a wrestler, he actually played in the Negro Leagues in Michigan. So he's also was a mentor to Rocky Johnson, as we mentioned him earlier, and to Joe Frazier. He held many regional titles, but never a world title. And he was involved in a very controversial moment of where in a match with Buddy Rogers for the NWA title, Buddy Rogers suffered a groin hit and couldn't continue the match, and so they had named Bobo the champion, but he refused the belt because he had won by a groin hit injury, and he didn't like that. But then it was determined that Buddy Rogers had faked the injury, and so they tried to award Bobo the title for that, but then the NWA refused to recognize Bobo as the champion.
Wow.
So I'm sure there was some politics and stuff like that going on in the background.
Is that a Dusty finish? I mean,
It sounds it.
That's pretty convoluted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he was also the last WWA World Heavyweight Champion, and when they merged with the NWA, he fought Gene Kiniski to a draw, and it was supposed to be a unification match. And at that point, the NWA determined that Kiniski was the true champion and deactivated the WWA Championship instead of uniting them.
Oh, wow.
And in a moment of parody, in 1993, he fought his last match. So that's 40 years after his first match. And he fought it against Kelly Kiniski, Gene Kiniski's son.
Damn, that's quite a stretch.
Yeah, to have that kind of a stay in professional wrestling, and in the time period that he did it in, was quite impressive.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's cool. Yeah, so I definitely heard the name Bobo Brazil before, and I knew sort of roughly when he was around. But it's really cool to learn some of the details of his story, and then his sort of title history there. All right, this is awesome. Thanks for digging up those three guys and sort of helping fill us in on their stories. So I know that we had noted that many territories kept their wrestlers segregated and sometimes even established, quote unquote, Negro championships. The World Colored Heavyweight, as one of our guys held. So most of those seem to be a gimmick more than a kind of legit bracket, and there seems to be very few records of or continuity of titles with black wrestlers. So Vero Small, Reginald Siki, and Bobo Brazil are just three of a long list of important figures. We could easily have talked about men like Bearcat Wright, Tiger Conway Sr., Rufus Jones, Ray Candy, and many more. And that's even before we get to, Ernie Ladd, Hacksaw Butch Reed, Junkyard Dog, and of course those who followed in their footsteps. If you're interested in hearing more of this kind of thing, these profiles, drop us a line at WrestleManiablog@gmail.com or tweet us at WrestleManiaPod on Twitter if there's somebody that you'd like to to dig into and talk a little bit about on the podcast. We'd be happy to do it. This stuff has been fascinating, honestly, to read and learn.
Yeah, so now that we covered some of the early names and some of the real pioneers of professional wrestling, we thought we would talk about some of the first black champions and stuff like that. And I think it's important to note to pay attention to how recent some of these dates are. So I thought we would just start off right away with Bearcat Wright.
Yes.
And Bearcat Wright is considered to be the first black professional wrestler to hold a world heavyweight title. In 1963, he defeated Classy Freddie Blassie. And it's interesting to note that was just 5 days before MLK's I Have a Dream speech. Bearcat was an interesting character. Once he got the title, he didn't want to give it up.
Good for him.
Yeah, so he had won the WWA World Heavyweight title, and he refused to turn it back over to Freddie Blassie or to Edouard Carpentier, the Flying Frenchman. So they ended up bringing in a shoot wrestler that was proficient in judo, and that's when Wright refused to get in the ring with him. And so that's when the WWA just stripped him of the belt and gave it to the Flying Frenchman, Edouard Carpentier.
Wow, that story's crazy. We were talking a little bit about that and trying to imagine sort of a similar scenario where somebody just has the belt and says, yeah, I'm good. I'm just going to hang on to this, and I'm not even going to get in the ring with your challenger. It's crazy.
And it's because like Bearcat Wright was so big. He was such a big guy, and he was extremely nimble with drop kicks and stuff. And so it was kind of like imagining like if like Brock Lesnar would not turn over the title, what do you do? Who do you get to fight him to force him to give it up?
Right. Who's going to take it? Yeah, do yourself a favor and Google Bearcat Wright and look at the pictures of this guy. He's a pure specimen. He's super impressive. So that was 1963. The next one we wanted to talk about actually was the first WWF Intercontinental Champion, which was Ahmed Johnson in 1996. So quite a span there before we get to more champions.
I mean, we had to get to the Attitude Era before we had
right.
an Intercontinental Champion that was black.
Yeah. And of course, Ahmed Johnson, in recent years has been pretty vocal about some of the, the racism he experienced, kind of behind the scenes at WWF at the time, and sort of the way that, he felt his particular career was stymied because of the color of his skin. So.
Yeah, which is surprising because he seems to have like all the attributes that Vince McMahon loves. Is like
seriously
muscle bound, ripped, athletic. He was huge and had character, but
yeah, he just could talk too.
Yeah, he just couldn't get anywhere, which was kind of surprising. And then suddenly he just kind of disappeared. And so that brings us to the first black WWF tag champions. And that was Soul Patrol, Rocky Johnson and Tony Atlas in 1983. So that does seem kind of far away, but the shocking thing is that the next black team of champions was Men on a Mission in 1994 when they possibly won the championship by accident. It's believed that like Mabel fell on top of the one guy in the Quebecers and he couldn't get up. He couldn't kick out of the pin, and they had no choice but to count to 3 and call the match as a win for Men on a Mission.
Wow. Yeah, he was huge. There's no squirming out from under that guy.
No.
Mabel was also the first black king of the ring. Was he Mabel or Viscera at the time? I can't remember.
He was still Mabel.
Okay. Yeah, that was 1995.
And then the first black women's champ in WWF was Jacqueline in 1998.
Wow. And the first to main event a WWF pay-per-view is Junkyard Dog against the Macho Man back in 1985 at the Wrestling Classic. It was the very first pay-per-view that he did after WrestleMania. They're kind of like, hey, this made some money. Let's do this again. We've just been watching this one in preparation to do a little special episode, a special non-WrestleMania episode on the Wrestling Classic. It's a fantastic show. Junkyard Dog is all over it through the tournament. So we're super excited to talk about that in a little bit and record that for y'all.
Yeah, and ignore what some of those haters on the internet seem to say about that show. That show was amazing, and it's well worth sitting down and watching.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe when we do the episode, we can read some of those reviews and try to figure out what's wrong with those people. I just think they're just lacking joy in general. So
then that brings us to the first WCW champion, and that was Ron Simmons. And this was in 1992, and it's kind of confusing because we had mentioned that Bobo Brazil had won the NWA championship, and that the WCW's direct lineage to NWA, you would think Bobo Brazil would be, but he's not. The NWA did not recognize Bobo Brazil as a champion, so Ron Simmons was also the first black NWA champion, technically.
Wow. All right, and then the last one that we wanted to hit was the first WWF World Champion is The Rock in 1998. So as Rich mentioned, quite a great history, but also a much shorter history than probably should have been, given the long-standing presence and contributions of black wrestlers. All right, you want to talk a little bit about some of our favorites? I think we've each picked our top 3.
Yeah, so we can go through my top 3.
Sure.
My top 3 actually starts off with a tag team, so I technically have top 4, I guess. My top 3 starts off with Booker T and Stevie Ray in Harlem Heat.
Yes.
Harlem Heat were amazing. They were incredibly talented. They had a great amount of ring chemistry, which makes sense since they were real-life brothers. They were 10-time tag team champions in WCW.
Man.
And even though they showed up in WCW in 1993, the original plan for their storyline was that they were to be introduced as wrestling slaves that
Lordy.
Colonel Parker had won in a poker game. But luckily, the WCW management was like, that's a little too far.
It is 1993.
So instead, they made them from Harlem, which...
Sure.
Okay. Yeah.
Those guys were unstoppable as a tag team. I'm a big fan as well.
Yeah, lots of people put them up there. Like, if you had to name the best WCW tag teams, you would just ping pong between Harlem Heat and the Steiner Brothers.
Yeah.
So the my next choice was the Junkyard Dog. A lot of this is just based off of his charisma, and some of his ring antics were amazing. And then that theme song that he had in the early '80s, "Grab Them Cakes." Let's just look at a lyric here or so. And when you get yourself started, it's hard to stop. You just go for your partners, you know what, and then you grab them cakes. The only reason why I could think of this being a theme song for him is that like the second verse starts off with "Ow, come on, dog." Talking to your mama, living his shirt off, living color.
What?
Yeah, I know.
Those words don't make sense in that particular order, but that's okay.
So apparently in the late 70s and early 80s, cakes was a slang term for a women's pair of butt cheeks.
I got it.
And I think it might have been coined by James Brown, actually. He had a song involving cakes at that point in time.
Yeah, that song slaps. Like I would listen to that in my car.
Yeah, I mean... But yeah, Junkyard Dog was a smooth talker, and I really loved him on that Hulk Hogan's
Yes.
Rock and Wrestling cartoon.
Yeah.
I loved his character, but IMDb revealed to me that he did not voice himself on that show.
Oh, that's disappointing.
I know, but he was actually voiced by James Avery,
Uncle Phil,
who was Uncle Phil. Yeah, Uncle Phil was his voice, and while I was there poking around, I learned that Brad Garrett was the voice of Hulk Hogan.
Oh man!
And David Arquette's dad, Louis Arquette, was the voice of Superfly Jimmy Snuka.
So many shocking discoveries for IMDb.
I know.
Well, that explains why Junkyard Dog was always throwing Jazz out of the house on Rock and Wrestling. You know?
Yeah.
It all kind of comes together now. I had JYD on my list as well, so I won't go into it. But I think I loved him for all the same reasons that you do. I actually just ordered the book King of New Orleans, which is his biography, and he had, of course, a sort of fascinating history as working primarily in the South, which at the time that he did it was super racist place to be, but much like maybe Bobo Brazil or other guys, his talent and his ability to draw money just led him to get booked anywhere and everywhere because they knew that people would show up to watch him. His WrestleMania performances that we've seen haven't been his best stuff, I would say. I mean, they're certainly decent matches and all that stuff, but they're not the JYD that that I really remember. My mom was a big JYD fan too. She got a kick out of him whenever he came on the TV.
And then like my final one is Bobby Lashley. I don't know how you can't be a fan of this guy. He's a unit. Like, he is ripped. He is a perfect specimen of a human being. Like, if they did a remake of Twins today, he would be Arnold Schwarzenegger's character, I think.
Could Kevin Hart play Danny DeVito's character?
That would be amazing. I think we need to immediately offer this idea up to the world.
I would watch the shit out of that movie.
Ask for a producer credit and sit on our big pile of cash after that.
Yeah, that would be great.
But he's so cool too when he's in the ring, and he's really the dominant black wrestler that WWE has been missing for pretty much its entire existence. They've never really had like this big muscle bound monster of a guy that could just destroy people in the ring. And so in my opinion, he's money, and he's extremely fun to watch. Yeah,
Bobby's great. And of course he's a shooter too, right? He's got legitimate wrestling cred, NCAA, I think, champion, as well as an MMA fighter with a solid record. He's one of those guys, actually, when I see him, I'm like, you're done lifting weights. Like, you've lifted all of the weights. Like, there's no more muscles for you to add to your muscles. You can just put them down now. Like, maybe just have a smoothie or something. So, all right, that's a great top three, Rich, I think. Like I said, I had JYD on my list as well, so I won't reiterate some of that stuff. But he gets a lot of credit as a trailblazer. That's maybe not as deserved as it should be, given, again, the history going back, decades before him. But he was a trailblazer in the sense that he was the big black draw for WWF at the time when WWF was getting to be about as big as it would ever be. And so I think that gave him exposure in a way that a lot of the earlier guys didn't quite have. So, another one on my list was Ron Simmons, Farouk, of course, The Acolytes, a variety of other gimmicks over the years. He was a professional football player, of course, before he became a professional wrestler. You know, he started out working for Jim Crockett Promotions and WCW in the mid '80s, and then of course comes over to WWF in the mid to late '90s with the Nation of Domination, and then the Accolade Protection Agency with JBL with Bradshaw. And you know, we've talked a little bit in the last couple of WrestleMania episodes about watching him in the ring. He's just such a badass. He's, I think, you know, a legitimate tough guy. He looks tough as hell. He can talk. He makes other guys look good, which I think is really underappreciated for his approach. Just a guy that I really never get tired of watching.
Yeah, he had great facials. Like, if you wanted to see what angry looks like, you look at Ron Simmons at almost any time.
He should do those. You know, they have those cards for like aspiring actors and stuff with the different emotions. You know, where you're trying to sort of get the facials right. He could totally be the angry. So Ron Simmons was one, and then the third one for me was Bad News Brown, aka Bad News Allen. We saw in a handful of WrestleManias as Bad News Brown. He's another guy who was a legit tough guy. He was a serious judo practitioner. He was actually the first African American to win a bronze medal in Olympic judo. He won in 1976 at the Summer Olympics in Montreal. There are a lot of great stories about him on the road. Just sort of known for being a lot of fun, and also, like I said, a legitimate badass. And he's got that kind of tough style in the ring, sort of very no nonsense, very kind of just knocked down in your face. And it was fascinating to me to learn that he had such a serious martial arts background for real.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I didn't know that about him, but it makes sense when you watch his ring work that he was very good at takedowns and holds and like really working guys over.
Yeah, cool guy for sure. Somebody you definitely didn't want to piss off because he could shoot on you.
Right, which makes sense that like his match against Piper was pretty good just because it was like such a conflict of styles. Like Piper was more of a boxer, striker kind of guy, and Bad News Brown was kind of a grappler, and so it made it for a really interesting match.
All right. Well, I think that's about it. I think maybe we'll wrap up here, but I want to, thank obviously everybody for joining us for the special popcorn match edition of All the WrestleManias in honor of Black History Month. I hope you'll join us again soon at allthewrestlemanias.podbean.com. You can also find us at allthewrestlemanias.wordpress.com. You can follow us on Twitter at WrestleManiaPod or drop us an email at WrestleManiablog@gmail.com. As I said, these popcorn matches are a chance for us to kind of dive into things that are not quite WrestleMania related, and so if there are topics like that, if you want to hear more about Black history and wrestling, we'd be happy to dig into it a little bit more. So drop us a note, shoot us a Twitter doodad, a tweet, I don't know what the kids say, and we'll we're looking for any excuse, honestly, to do this again.
Is that a TikTok?
I think so.
Is that one of the TikToks?
I don't know.
Okay.
Oh my God, we're so old. It's fine. So if you, if you heard something here that you like, take a few minutes, read about one of these guys. Rich recommended a video. It's easy enough to Google, folks. There's a rich history. This is just the very tip of the stories out there.
Well, for now, this is Rich and Tim, and we're signing off for All the WrestleManias. Have a great one.